Hello everyone. For our last podcast of 2020, we bring you a slight change of pace by talking about another podcast. Fidellithy Tan is a fellow Singaporean who is also writer and host of the History of Colonization podcast. Beginning with the Portuguese colonization of Ceuta in 1415 at the start of the so-called Age of Discovery, she aims to provide an introduction to Western colonization of Latin America, Africa and Asia, and how colonialism continues to impact our lives today. Sean and I met up with her to talk about how she came up with the podcast, what she aims to achieve, and her thoughts on history, colonialism, and education in Singapore. As a historian and educator and someone who works on decolonization, I had a great time, especially talking with someone so young who is working so hard to create something so interesting about an insufficiently understood part of our own history, and understanding how so much of what happened in Singapore in the 18th, 19th, 20th century actually stems from things which happened on the other side of the world 300-400 years before that. So I'm so delighted another Singaporean is writing and creating this podcast. Please do check it out. Links in the show note. As always, if you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please do support our work, newnarrative.com/join to join as a member, newnarrative.com/donate to donate. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the podcast. See you next year.
Stay where you are. We've come way too far. Where you think that you're gonna go? This is utopia. Please stay where you are. We've come way too far. Where you think that
So, the History of Colonization podcast, tell us about it. What is it?
Right, so it's a chronological podcast that traces the history of colonization, but specifically European colonization from around the early 15th century to the 20th century. So right now I'm currently around the period of the Portuguese discovery of India.
So I guess the first obvious question, Fidellithy, is what's up with your name? You have one of the most unique names that I have ever seen. Not in terms of how it's pronounced, but in terms of how it's spelled.
Yeah. So, right, my parents decided that it would be a good idea, I don't know why, to look into the dictionary, pick a random word, and add several letters to it to make it unique so people would remember me.
Right.
Yeah, that's how it came about.
Okay.
But yeah, growing up, I had a lot of trouble with teachers trying to pronounce my name, butchering my name mostly.
Yeah, thank you for that for that explanation. And so, how does a Singaporean? You're in your final year at university, you think?
Yeah, NTU history.
Cool.
Yeah.
And so, how does a Singaporean end up doing a podcast on the history of colonization?
Right. Well, I guess I have to get into why I got interested in colonization in the first place. So I went on exchange to the Netherlands last year, and I got to visit a lot of museums and talk to a couple of people there. And what I found in museums was how there was a lack of representation of people of color, of Asians, of minorities. And so I think at some point I got really sick of just looking at white men being exhibited in art museums and history museums, how the whole narrative was centered around them. And so I started to ask, why is this so? And then I found a couple of museums that were engaged in post-colonial work, where they were asking questions about why there were so many white men in the narrative. And so from then on, I started to read more about colonization. And so eventually I came back to NTU, and I took a couple of courses in colonization and decolonization. And so, yeah, that's how I really got interested in it. And afterwards, I started talking to my friends about it. And I realized that a lot of people really don't know anything about colonization.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask as well. Where does that intuition to look at a museum and say there's a lack of representation, where does that come from? Because, when I was young, going and looking at museums, looking at art galleries, and even friends my age, right?
Yeah.
You know, we go and look at museums and galleries and things. It didn't strike me back then, and it doesn't strike a lot of people, that there's a lack of representation, that there are problematic ideas or problematic
Yeah.
representations. So where did that intuition come from? Because I'm sure a lot of people on exchange would just be like, wow, it's so pretty. It's like, oh my God, it's so new, right? But where did that come from?
Right. So I guess part of the reason was I traveled alone, so I had a lot of time to think and reflect. And so I had a journal that I would keep, and I would write about all the exhibits I was going to. And it was just really frustrating that there was just no conversation about it. I don't know, like, I've always just liked asking questions, so I guess that was how I got into it. And I guess I was taking a couple of classes, just reading up by myself before exchange, so naturally one thing led to another, and I just felt compelled to ask questions about it.
Nice.
Yeah.
So you said, okay, when you got back to Singapore, then
Yeah.
you started talking to friends about it, and then you
Yeah.
realized that nobody knew much about colonization.
Yeah.
And I think that's certainly quite true for me. I still don't know much about
Yeah.
it. Why do you think it's important for people to know about colonization as opposed to, the typical bread and butter issues, current affairs? Why are we looking back into, not ancient, but, the history that's been so
Yeah.
far gone? Why
Yeah.
should we pay attention to that?
Yeah, because I think what a lot of people don't realize is how relevant the history of colonization is to current day issues of racism, sexism, how minorities are being treated, and I think especially in Singapore, how the whole legal system is structured. It follows the colonial system of repression, and so it's why I think it's crucial to engage in these colonial narratives to understand how these systems came about and how we can better deal with them and engage with these current day systems.
So what made you want to start a podcast as opposed to like a website, or what's the story behind that, the origin story?
Right. So it was kind of just a way for me to learn more about colonization in my own time, because it's what I'm interested in as a research focus. And I thought, well, why not, tell my friends about it, since they didn't know much about colonization. And so, yeah, that was what I wanted to do at first, just reach a very small audience of Singaporean friends. But then, like, eventually, I guess it grew bigger. And for some reason, I think people have been searching up certain terms on Spotify or Apple. And so, like, most of my listeners now actually come from the UK and the US. Yeah, and Singapore was like third or something.
Wow.
Yeah, so I've gotten an unexpected audience. Yeah.
I mean, it's great that these people are the ones listening.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
the- in a way.
Sean, how
shit.
did you find out about the podcast? Because you were the one who told me about it.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, I heard about it. I mean, I met her through, let's say, a mutual friend, right? And then from there, she started telling me about a podcast that she was doing. So I thought, okay, she's doing a podcast. Why not just check it out? And then I just felt like, I mean, the first thing that struck me was just the massive wall of data and information and historical sources.
Yeah.
And I thought that, like, wow, like, wow, this is an amazing amount of work to put in for a project. So that's kind of how I got in on that project that Fidellithy is doing. Yeah.
So, Fidelity, if I can ask, there's some things which jumped out at me immediately looking at your podcast. And one is, where do you plan to end it?
Right.
Because
That's it.
colonization. Well, I guess before we ask that, maybe I'll ask,
Yes.
why did you start where you started, right? Because colonization is something, it comes from the Roman word, where Rome would conquer new lands and then build up colonies there.
Yes.
So, in theory, you could have started from the Roman Empire. You could have started from China. You could have started from South Asia.
Yeah.
But why European expansion?
Right. So I guess this boils down to the difference between imperialism and colonization. I think the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines colonization as the European settlement and political conquest of peoples from the Americas, Asia, and Africa. And so that's what I really wanted to focus on, not the imperialism part, not Roman conquest and Chinese conquest, but what I saw as a problem that needed to be addressed and conversation that needed to be had was around European colonization. So what I started from was 1415 in Ceuta, and how Europeans first started colonizing territories outside of Europe. So that's where I started from.
That's very interesting you start at Ceuta because as you observe,
Yes.
it's still a colony of Spain
Yes.
today.
Yes.
And it always amuses me when Spain demands Gibraltar back because I'm like, but you've been holding on to Ceuta for how long? Ceuta and what's the other one? They have two colonies, right, on
Yes.
the Moroccan side of the Mediterranean. And so, I find incredibly hypocritical that Spain keeps demanding Gibraltar back when they themselves are
Exactly.
two colonies, and
Yeah.
and of course, like, do they actually the Canary Islands, all the islands in the Atlantic? There's all these very interesting questions that you raise.
Yeah.
And this brings me to the sort of second point or the second interesting thing is, this is explicitly a sort of critique of the white man version of history, but it's going to be very difficult to foreground the voices of the minority, of the oppressed peoples of the indigenous peoples of those places that you're talking about, especially since they're not easily available in English. And I note how you've been trying to foreground those voices, but have you found it very, very difficult to do so?
Yeah, so it was very taxing, to be honest. And I found that problem especially, it started with Columbus. So what I found was that pre-Columbine history was really hard to find. Like, you only have a few books on archaeological histories. Honestly, aren't like as comprehensive as I would like. And so, yeah, there hasn't been much literature on it, so I had to go digging for those books. And I mean, obviously, I'm concerned about representing them in the right way, considering how few sources there are out there. But, well, I try with what limited resources I have. But yeah, there's definitely that concern.
Okay, so that comes back to my other earlier question then, like the scope of this, right?
Yes.
Because European expansionism defines our modern world,
Yeah.
and arguably, it's still going on. Europe still holds. I mean, Reunion Island, for example, is French,
Yep.
even though it's off the coast it's in the middle of the Indian Ocean. If you've ever taken the Paris to Reunion flight, that's the world's longest domestic flight, which is quite hilarious. It's like, was it 15, 18 hours? It's a domestic flight all the way across the world. And so there's this island that's part of the EU in the middle of the Indian Ocean.
Yeah.
So European expansionism still is with us and defines the world today. And then, of course, colonialism is no longer a European phenomenon,
Yeah.
right? We have the Chinese, we have Indonesia in Papua, we have, the status of Sabah and Sarawak, we have the Rohingya, and the sort of occupation of land by a government, arguing that, through all sorts of justifications that land is actually theirs. And that's become that's been diversified. So where are you going to end?
I guess, it's really a very non-exhaustive podcast, just the topic of colonization itself. I guess I would end at decolonization movements in the 20th century, late 20th century. But honestly, it could go on. It could, change into like a podcast just discussing on the impacts of colonization in the world right now. So
Oh yes, that would be
Yeah.
fascinating.
so yeah, I don't have a particular endpoint. It's just I was just planning to keep going.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I guess that tells us a bit about your process, which I was also curious about. Because
Yes.
how far ahead have you sketched this whole thing, or are you basically like just writing episodes as you go? Do you have a big arc that you've thought through, or
Yeah, I don't have a big arc. I just research as it comes. So
how many episodes ahead are you now of the one you've broadcast? Have you written the next one or the next two?
I'm actually in the process of writing the next one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
So, but
And-
yeah, I've done I have a couple of books that I've read through on the Portuguese Empire, on the Portuguese Empire and on the Spanish Empire. So, Yeah, I kind of have a brief timeline in my head on how the podcast is going to go in terms of those empires. But other than that, I was just planning to read more and see how it goes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah, I mean that's totally fine. You don't need to, we're I guess we're kind of learning and exploring alongside you as you learn these things and as you discover new things. The listener, we get to learn them with you. So that's a very interesting approach.
So I also just, it's becoming very, very clear to me that, I'm speaking to two historians here. So I'm just, so just now PJ said something along the lines of European expansionism, is one of the key forces that defines the world that we live in today.
Yeah.
And I won't lie, there's a part of my brain that was like, can you tell me more about that? Because I'm not, I get that colonization is a huge thing and it has huge impacts on society. But tangibly, can you tell how? Like, let's say if we were to simplify this for a layperson, how does it materialize into 21st century, 2020? How does it materialize into today, the here and the now?
I mean, in Singapore, it's pretty obvious if you look at our built environment, our street names, how, say, Raffles Institution is our elite school that we have, or Raffles Place, or how like the statue of Raffles is still up there, and how the government defines the bicentennial as originating from 1819. And so, I mean, it's definitely in the environment we live in and how we speak in English and the sort of mindset we have. That's very, I should say, Western influence.
How do you think that affects the psyche of the individual? Because I can hear already some horror story comments on Wake Up Singapore, right? You have that type of commenter who's going to go, yeah, but so what? It's just nice architecture. It's just a language, right? Who cares, right? It's just an index for like different places in Singapore, Raffles Place, Raffles City, Raffles Girls' School. Who cares, right? It's just a name. What is the impact? The subterranean evil lurking beneath that we don't see.
When I think of this, I think of how I think Giorgio had an analogy where he went to Britain and then this army officer from the UK told him about how Singaporeans are a very well colonized people.
What?
Yeah, I know. And so I think there's just a lot of in the Singaporean subconsciousness that's just subtly affected by everything around us. That Singapore is the exception in Southeast Asia that embraces colonialism, especially with the merger and all.
Well, if you don't mind me jumping in.
Yes.
And, Sean, thank you for your question earlier, because this is exactly why I'm glad you're here. It didn't even occur to me to like define European expansionism. So sorry to you and to my audience, our audience out there. We all have blind spots. But with regards to sort of the damage, right? The person to read is Frantz Fanon, a medical doctor who was also anti-colonial, and he wrote a lot of literature on this about the damage to the human psyche caused by colonization, because colonization isn't just physical and political. People don't just come and govern. They then impose ways of thinking upon us that we then take on board, and it becomes subconscious to us that we accept our subjugation, right? We accept our inferiority, and then we shape the world in accordance with this idea that we are inferior. And so if you look at former colonial countries, a huge part of the problem is not simply winning political independence, but then winning intellectual independence, economic independence, removing your dependence from the former colonial power. The fact that we speak in English, right, shows the continued dominance of the British Empire and British and American intellectual capital, intellectual soft power on the world today, right? And so literally we are unable to communicate in our own languages. We have to use their language, which means we have their values, their assumptions in how we speak and how we think, because language really influences how you think, how you behave. And then this natural gravitation, because it then becomes easier to do business with the West. It becomes easier to take on Western ideas. It becomes easier to associate yourself with the West, right? So all those things, but then also this continued idea, especially in Singapore, as Fidellithy was saying, that if we think of colonialism as having been a good thing, then we accept today continued subjugation as being a good thing. And that's part of why we don't stand up for ourselves and our rights with respect to the current government when it bullies us, when it oppresses us, when it passes stupid laws which just make our lives really difficult and make theirs, expand their power in really arbitrary ways, POFMA being one example, right? We accept it because we just think, oh, that's the way that the world should be. But if you think about, even 40, 50 years ago, 2 generations ago in Singapore, we didn't accept it, and we didn't think of it that way. And part of the reason was, because the world's so different, because majority of Singaporeans didn't speak English, because they weren't indoctrinated through the schools, and so had escaped this indoctrination of colonization, and so it's just very dangerous when you have we're like a puppy who's been kicked so many times and who's normalized the idea that being kicked is how the master shows love for it. That's who we are today. That's a huge problem.
So now that I have the just the good fortune of being in the presence of 2 historians, right? I want to ask, when I was young, right, studying history and studying social studies, right, it always struck me as very odd that we loved colonization so much. I mean, because from my perspective, why would you like that? It's such a horrible, pathetic story, right? That these white people came in and then you served them. And then when it was inconvenient, they left. Why would you build a monument to these people? Why would you, name your best schools and best institutions after these people? So why? I don't get it. It's so odd. I don't know if other countries are doing this. I don't think that they are. But why are we so in love?
No.
Yeah, why are we in love with the people that had this awful relationship? That's like, I like you now, but then it's inconvenient. Bye. Like, why would we ever be in love with that?
It's not even inconvenient. Like, we actually kicked them out. This is something that's de-emphasized in our own history, how much we struggle, because our anti-colonial protests and struggles and riots of the 50s now, because of it's inconvenient in our history, are now recast as, they were communist riots, and like Hockley and so on. These were actually anti-colonial struggles that we should be holding up as examples of how we fought and drove the British out.
So you're saying the Hockley bus riots were anti-colonial in some way, shape or form?
Okay. In some way, shape or form. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
If you want to learn more, listen to the history of Singapore
let's not go to it. It's just very
explaining that the bus strike and how it turned into a riot will take a long time.
Yes, yeah, okay. Let's not go there. But that is new. That is completely alien information to me. That is completely new.
Really?
Yeah.
Hey, you haven't listened to my podcast?
I don't.
Oh no.
This is where I get caught. But yes, yeah. So why do you think that Singaporeans, right, are so in love with colonial icons, or just very okay with the idea that we were colonized?
Right. So I think it comes down to the inculcation of the Singapore story in the education system, how 1819 was the turning point from a fishing village, supposedly, to modernity, to economic prosperity, to, let's say, social progress, and cosmopolitanism. And so why it's emphasized so much in the education system is because the Singaporean government essentially prides itself as a sort of continuation of that, but not of the white men. They are not the white men. They are the locals who are continuing this narrative of economic prosperity that they'll bring to Singaporeans. And so that's why it's cast in the education system as being such a wonderful thing. Because that was what civilized Singapore.
So speaking about the education system, right?
Yes.
I mean, so we have a messed up education system, clearly,
Yes.
right? And your efforts here look to be sort of re-educative, to kind of dismantle some of the
Yep.
of the weird ideas that we
Yes.
have, and shed some light on the things that have gone on that we're not really paying attention to, right? So what do you hope to achieve in your audience? How do you want to make them feel? What do you want them to think? How do you want them to sort of change, or how do you want them to grow from your podcast?
Yeah, so in my podcast, I don't explicitly come out and say colonization is bad. But what I do is I speak of narratives. I tell them about the nuances in colonialism, class structures, race, gender, and all that. And like what I want to do is give people the information they need to deconstruct these narratives on their own, or in conversations with other people. So, and from that, like they can decide what to do with that information.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there are a bunch of theorists right now who
Yes.
are, very central to the ideas surrounding post-colonial theory. So people like Spivak and Fanon and Shom. Now, I guess right now, I think that these are extremely powerful ideas, right?
Yeah.
But they can be a bit difficult to access, right?
Yes.
So how do you think that these ideas can be brought into the mainstream? How do you think that these ideas can be disseminated? Is it going to be? Is that something that you hope to achieve with having an academic career, or is that something that you would want to put into your podcast or into your work?
Yeah, so I think the work of post-colonial theorists is just subconsciously reflected in what I do for the podcast. I mean, reading Fanon, Césaire, and Membe was like the turning point of my life. Like just people coming out to say Europe is indefensible, that sort of thing, and violence against the colonizer was inevitable, that sort of thing. But regarding how I would put it in my work, I guess it's a bit hard to fit into the podcast, especially since I'm going in a chronological order, and like post-colonial theorists would be like in the latter half of the 20th century. But yeah, that's definitely an avenue I want to explore. Although it'll probably be a few years before I eventually get there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess the question here is of course decolonization is such a big movement right now. It's something that I think in the academy is really coming up, right? What do you think is the import? What do you think is we can get out of these ideas? How do you think that they can positively affect individuals, right? Like yourself. So you said it was very life-changing, right? What is the material, direct impact that these theories or these ideas have had on you?
Right. So I guess when I was reading about colonization, I had this like vague idea in the back of my mind, like this is really bad. And like, basically I was thinking of like something similar to what Césaire was saying about Europe and how it's indefensible, but to actually have someone prominent coming out to say this and write this and be written about. That was what legitimized my view on it, and essentially telling me that, oh, this view is right, this view is okay to have, because people have come out to say things about it, and it might seem radical to you at first, but the fact that people have spoken about it makes it real. And so that was what sparked my interest in colonization.
So what's
speaking about it?
If you had to pick, if you could share with us like one extremely profound idea that affected you a lot, right?
Yeah.
What would that be? What was the one thing that you read and you were like, oh my God, this is that big concept, what was that?
Right.
you?
So I guess it would be Franz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, especially the part on violence. So before that, I think I would consider myself somewhat of a pacifist. But after reading Fanon, I was like, I guess violence is necessary in some contexts when you're completely oppressed, when there's no way of making your voice heard. That's where the violence of the colonized comes into the picture. That's the only way to stand your ground and say, hey, this is not right. And since you're not listening to me, I have to resort to violence. And that was kind of life-changing for me because like I went from being a pacifist to somewhat of a, well, I guess violence is okay in certain contexts.
Well, thanks for that. And is there anything? So I suppose if you people who are listening to this podcast, right?
Yes.
And who want to learn more about colonization, are there particular books that you really enjoyed, or anything you really thought was very interesting that eye-opening?
I mean, there are a lot of books out there, but I would say before reading like a book on the history of the British Empire or the Portuguese Empire, like it would be wise to go into the post-colonial theories first. So definitely Fanon and Césaire. Those I would highly recommend for people to get a sense of like the structure, the ways in which they should be looking at colonization through before looking at say encyclopedic books on the history of empires.
And I guess as a young person, like how would you convince other young people? This is something I think I'd be very interested in, sort of deprogramming. You've been through, I was lucky enough to get out of the education system the year that the Singapore story was introduced. So I never had to go through that programming, right? But both of you went through all that programming. How, if someone wants to deprogram themselves or at least get alternative perspectives, where should they start?
I think they should start from New Narrative.
I just want to add, this was not a paid endorsement. I didn't ask her to say that. She just totally volunteered it, and I'm so happy.
And Wake Up Singapore. Yeah.
This looks suspicious, extremely suspicious.
But I mean, definitely like the work that you guys do is probably like the most accessible place to start rather than, say, delving straight into academic books that do with this. So, yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you.
So, you are currently doing a thesis
Yes.
on colonization. You're doing a thesis on... It's as your final year project,
Yes.
right? And then after that, you have plans for higher education,
Yes.
right? How has that played out so far? Being a Singaporean, how did you have to explain to your parents like, hey, I'm going to do history and colonization and decolonization, and I'm going to do that professionally for the rest of my life, right? How does that? Was that a difficult conversation to have?
Well, I guess I'm kind of lucky that my parents are like, just do what you want. It's okay if you don't get into STEM or anything. And if you want to go into academia and potentially be unemployed, it's fine too.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I want to question your assumption there, Sean, because a history degree doesn't mean you have to be a historian.
Okay.
Because what is history? Studying history is taking a lot of information and being able to talk about patterns, analyze narratives, find causality, break down assumptions. Mm-hmm. Those skills are applicable to anything you do in life, right? You don't have to be a historian. History is analyzing data, analyzing narratives, and very human ones rather than mathematically driven data. This is human data. So this is a point I made when I was a history teacher, and students were asking me, this was in a secondary school in Singapore, right? Students were asking me, well, why take history? And I said, with the kind of skills you learn when you take history, you can apply them to anything you do in life. And actually, a lot of Singapore's early civil servants, locally educated Singapore-born civil servants, were graduates of the history program at the University of Malaya, partly because of the skills that they had, and partly because the head of the history program at U of M back then, wanted to educate lots of local students to, because he said these are people who are going to need the education to run the country. So he actually took in more than he was supposed to. But a lot of our early civil servants who helped build this country after independence were history graduates. So you can see the applicability of a history degree.
I fully agree that a history degree is extremely applicable, and I think it goes for the rest of the arts and humanities as well. My question comes from a place of having, spoken to a lot of young people, activists, things like that, who right now, beginning in their career, find it difficult to have to explain to their parents, I'm going to do an arts degree, or I'm going to be involved in political work, right? And this is a sort of a tumultuous time because the career is beginning and everything. So we may know it's applicable. It's something that's practical. It's something that we could do a lot with. The thing is, how do we explain to parents? How do we explain to relatives? How do we find our footing? How do we negotiate, right? The trade-offs here, less pay, it's a little less secure. Will I get POFMAD if I say something wrong? Will people send me hate mail? FAP used to do this horrible tactic where they would post people's pictures as a post and shame them. Will that happen to me? So that's something that a lot of young activists are thinking about. That they are negotiating. So that's kind of what I'm wondering about in Fidellithy's situation here.
Yeah, but in my context, like my parents are all right with it.
Okay.
I'm lucky enough for that. I told my mom I was setting up a podcast on the history of colonization, and she was like, "What is colonization?" So then I had to go on about, do you know Raffles? Do you know like the British Empire? And they came to Singapore, and I did a really watered down version of it. But yeah. She's fine with it. I don't think she thinks I'm gonna get POFMAD, so I think that's fine.
Yeah, and I think what you're doing, Fidellithy, is really important in ways that might not be very obvious, right? Because activism and trying to make the world a better place, trying to create spaces for thought and discussion. These don't have to be directly confrontational of the government, but a strong, vibrant society has space for lots and lots of ideas and discussions, requires a lot of different people doing a lot of different things at very different levels, and it's not, trying to create these spaces and trying to educate people and trying to help people think and learn. This is a form of activism, especially in a country which imposes such a strong ideological narrative on the students. But it's not confrontational the way that, say, what New Narrative and I and Wake Up Singapore and Sean do, right? That's way more confrontational, but it's equally as valuable, right? And if it ends up that a lot of people listen to your podcast and start learning and thinking about colonization, that would be a really great service to society and every bit as important as those of us who, are putting out things which are more directly critical. And society just needs a great diversity of viewpoints, and that's what you're helping build.
Yeah.
Okay, so Fidellithy, I guess the final question: what are some of your plans for the podcast? Where would you like to take it? What do you have lined up? Where do you want to go with this?
Right, so I'm kind of just having a monologue on the podcast right now, but I would love to have more discussions. So I would love to have more historians, academics, or anyone with an interest in the field on the show. So we can discuss more about, like, say, social history, culture history, aside from the timeline I've been going on. So yeah, that's kind of what I want to have in future podcasts, just more discussions.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. That sounds great. Okay, so I guess on that note, we're out of time. So a big thank you, Fidellithy, for joining us on our podcast today. And if people want to find your podcast, how do they do that?
They can access it from Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts. Yeah.
Cool. And a big thank you to my co-host, Sean.
Hi, thanks.
And,
That was
Wake
really
Up
lovely, really lovely discussion. Very eye-opening as well. For somebody that's that's primarily focused on the here, the now, the current events, material condition, blah blah. Looking at the history of colonization, I think it's a new perspective for me, right? Learning how the past, how our history comes into the here and now and materializes in its effects. I think that is something that I'm going to take away from this session. Yeah.
Cool.
So yeah, thanks so much for joining us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do check out History of Colonization. And then stay tuned because we'll be interviewing more young activists in the weeks to come.
And that was Fidellithy Tan, Sean Francis Han, and I talking about her podcast, The History of Colonization. Please do support our work at newnarrative.com/join to join as a member, newnarrative.com/donate to donate. Thank you very much. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. See you in 2021.
We've come way too far. Where you think that you're gonna go? This is utopia. Please stay where you are. We've come way too far. Where you think that you're